We're going to continue on with our series today called Receiving Jesus. And in this series, we're looking at different characters in the Gospels and different characters in the Christmas story, some of which received Jesus and some of which did not receive Jesus. And on one side, we're looking at characteristics of people's hearts that led them to either receive him or not receive him, as well as characteristics of the nature of Jesus, how he moves, how he operates, how he comes. There's certain tendencies, there's ways that he moves that we can glean from the Christmas story. And it's not just about having received him once when we said a prayer the initial time that we gave our life to Jesus, but on a daily basis. We get to welcome him in. We get to usher him in. We get to invite him to do what he desires to do. In the first week we talked about, it was titled Unexpected and Uncomfortable. And we talked about Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph were faithful to the Lord. And the Lord came and he brought a new thing. He brought them into a new purpose. And it wasn't expected. It wasn't comfortable. There was a cost to it. And yet they were willing to count that cost. They were willing to step into the new things that God had, even though it was a tough road. And they received Jesus, even though it was unexpected. And we talked about how we can go to the Lord with that same anticipation and desire to usher Jesus in whatever way he's wanting to move. Jesus, what do you want for Christmas? What is it you're wanting to do in me or through me or around me? What is it that you desire? Even if there's a cost to it, even if it's uncomfortable, I want to usher you in, just like Mary, saying, I'm a servant of the Lord. Let it be done according to your word. Then in week 2, we talked about Simeon. Simeon had been promised that he would see the Messiah before he died. He was holding on to this promise, and he probably was waiting longer than he expected, and yet he contended for what he knew was coming. He contended even when it became difficult to contend, even when it took longer. We talked about walking in that patience, or also translated that long suffering of Jesus. That sometimes when we're contending for something, if God has spoken or he's directed or he's brought us into a new season, it's easy to start contending for something. It's much harder to see it through, especially when it takes longer than we expected or there's suffering involved. But we get to share in the suffering of Jesus. It's one thing to suffer for someone. It's another thing to suffer with someone. We get to suffer with Christ. Like we talked about, when we suffer with him, we actually get to experience greater measures of his comfort, greater measures of his life, of all that he came to fulfill. That in walking with him, he doesn't just send us off and say, hey, come back when you've done what I've told you to do. He actually walks with us. It's his patience. It's his long suffering through his Spirit inside of us, that fruit of the Spirit, that allows us to actually walk with Christ even through the suffering. This week, we're going to talk about some people who didn't receive Jesus, because not everybody did. We're talking about King Herod and Jerusalem. And this sermon is titled Unrivaled. Jesus is unrivaled. There's no other name. There's no other throne. There's no other principality or power of darkness. There's no one in all of existence, in all of eternity, that even comes close to the name of Jesus. He's unmatched. He's far above every other name. And sometimes we walk this balance between knowing that Jesus is love, absolutely. But his love is not something to be taken advantage of. That we could just walk and do whatever we want and say, well, Jesus is loving, he's gracious, he'll take care of it even after I do whatever it is. But he is loving, but he is also the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. He deserves our awe. He deserves our respect. What he says goes. What his word says goes. He's not here to adapt to what we desire him to be. We're here to posture ourselves based on who we know him to be through his word. He's unrivaled. And that's a good thing. It requires us to humble ourselves, but it's a good thing. we get to rest in knowing that there is no one like Jesus. But we're going to look at King Herod because he had a choice to make. We're going to read in a second that he was made aware that a king was coming. The Messiah was coming, and he had a choice to make. Would he humble himself and give up his throne, or would he hold on to his throne? Let's go ahead and turn to Matthew 2. We're going to start in verse 1. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled." So Herod's first reaction is he's troubled. I can't say that I'm surprised. That's probably what we would expect. Herod was a wicked king. He was actually an illegitimate king of the throne of Israel, for one. The Messiah would come through the line of David, who was from the line of Jacob. Herod knew he wasn't from the line of Jacob or David. He was from the line of Esau. He was an Edomite. Now, on top of that, he was appointed into his role. Israel was under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire. Herod was appointed into the role. So he's not the rightful heir of the throne that he sat on. He wasn't the rightful heir of the throne of Israel. So when he got word that there was someone born in Bethlehem who was the king of the Jews, that's threatening to him. Immediately, that's threatening to him. And because of his pride, he wasn't willing to give up his throne. Only one person can sit on the throne. Herod deep down knew he wasn't the one to sit on the throne, but he wanted to do everything he could to keep it. He was vulnerable to these claims that a child had been born king. Pride is the overflow of our flesh. So in our own lives, when we see pride, we know it's coming from the flesh. Which means that when we see pride, we know we can go to Christ and say, "Would you cut this out of me?" That's a good thing. But it's the result of our flesh. Pride, just like with Herod, is the desire to control, the desire to maintain a status quo that is favorable to us, the desire to get our own way. Whenever we see pride in our lives, it can manifest in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's the enemy's crafty in how he crafts pride in us. But the root of pride is the flesh. Thankfully, by the Spirit, that pride, that flesh can be cut away, and we can go to the Father and say, "Hey, would you prune me?" But here we see the overflow of that flesh in Herod because he doesn't desire to part with his control. He doesn't desire to part with his throne. He doesn't desire to part with the status quo that he's been so careful to maintain. And he's threatened by this little baby in a manger. Now, like I said, Herod being troubled or threatened by this isn't a surprise. What is a surprise is the second half of verse 3. After he just got done saying that Herod was troubled, it says, "And all Jerusalem with him." Now this is strange. All Jerusalem is troubled with their wicked king. They'd been waiting for the Messiah for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They'd been waiting for this king to come. The anointed one of Isaiah 61. The shoot of Jesse from Isaiah 11. Emmanuel, God with us from Isaiah 7. The suffering servant from Isaiah 53. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The government will be on his shoulders. His government and his peace will have no end. The Messiah is here. Word comes that the baby's been born, and yet all of Jerusalem, his people, are troubled. Why would that be? Shouldn't there be celebration in the streets? What they've finally been waiting for, what all the prophets point to. The whole Old Testament is foreshadowing the coming of this king. Shouldn't they be celebrating in the streets? And yet they're disturbed when they hear the news. Why? Even before they could investigate the scriptures to see if it was true, even before they could confirm, their gut reaction was they were troubled. The same reaction of their wicked king. I think there's a couple things going on. There are some who believe that because the people of Jerusalem knew the wickedness and the violence and the torment of King Herod, they were actually afraid of what would happen through Herod if there was another king. They were afraid of the violence. They were afraid of the bloodshed. They were afraid of the persecution. So in some ways, you could say that they were probably looking at the situation with fear of the worst possible outcome. Sometimes the fear of the worst possible outcome actually keeps us from walking in the best possible outcome. That's what's happening here. Jesus is the best possible outcome, and yet the fear of the worst outcome keeps them from stepping into it, from receiving him. Now, on the other side, as we read through the Gospels, we realize that there's a religious hierarchy within the Jewish community. And some of their troubledness probably came similar to Herod from some measure of pride or control. They had constructed a system that was incredibly advantageous for them. It worked in their favor. They were at the top. They had control. They had the status quo. Could it have been that pride began to sink in where they didn't desire the status quo to change? They would rather have control over a system by which they could earn their salvation than to actually receive the one who would bring salvation in and of himself. They were actually more comfortable just with the system and the status quo than to actually yield and humble themselves to the one who would come and fulfill the system. Jesus was the greatest thing that could ever happen to them, and yet they were troubled. Jesus, in all of his entirety, is the greatest thing that could happen to us, and yet sometimes we're troubled when he leads us somewhere we don't want to go. We want Jesus in our status quo. We want Jesus within our control or our confines or our boundaries or our walls. We like when Jesus stays in the lines. Yet Jesus doesn't often stay within our lines. When we follow Jesus, we're actually dying to ourselves and picking up a cross and following him. Jerusalem wasn't willing to do that. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem later on. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to lay down our pride, lay down our fears, and actually pick up our cross, having died to ourselves, and follow Jesus? Because we can't receive Jesus without humility. It requires us to be humble in order to receive Jesus. He doesn't coexist with our pride. Let's move on to verse 4. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem in Judea, for so it was written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least of these rulers in Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So Herod wants to know, could this actually be the Messiah? He wants to know from the scriptures. Though he doesn't live according to the scriptures, he wants to know. He knows there's a king that's meant to take his throne. He knows he's not the one that's supposed to sit on that throne. He needs to know because he's trying to maintain control. So he goes and he collects some of the chief priests and the scribes. The fact that it says it that way, that he went and assembled some of the chief priests and the scribes, it probably wasn't a formal meeting of the Sanhedrin. He was not on good terms with the Sanhedrin. the ruling class, right? So he grabs some of them in an informal meeting, an ad hoc gathering, and he says, is this actually true? And they look up and they find that in Micah, it actually does talk about Bethlehem, that a ruler will come from Bethlehem. So now he's got these wise men that are saying, hey, we've come to worship a king that's been born in Bethlehem. He goes to the scriptures and realizes this could actually be him. So in verse 7, he goes, and it says, then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. That's going to be important later. Verse 8, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me a word that I too may come worship him. So he ascertains from them what time the star appeared. Now he's hoping that they'll go and find the Messiah and come tell him. But if they don't, he wants to make sure he knows who he's looking for, how old the boy is that he's looking for. So he's actually buying his own insurance to say, hey, if these guys don't find him or they don't come back, I want to know at least generally what I'm working with. So he's ascertaining from them when the star appeared. And we're going to see that later. But notice it says, go search diligently for the child. Different than the baby, the word for baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, like the night of the birth. So a lot of times we set up our nativities and the wise men are there and the shepherds and everybody. But this wasn't the same time, right? They're going and looking for a child, not a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. So they go off. They've been given this mandate by Herod to go find the Messiah and bring him back so that Herod could worship them. Now, they're not from this area. They don't know Jewish culture. They're probably Gentiles. They don't have any reason to believe that Herod would actually have ill intent towards the Messiah. So they very well could have thought, yeah, let's go find him, and then we can bring him to the king, and then it'll be this beautiful moment. They don't know. They're from far away. But they go, and they begin searching for the Messiah. Verses 9 through 11, they follow the star to Bethlehem. They came to the house and saw the child. They fell down and worshiped him and offered him gifts. We're going to talk about this more in depth on Tuesday night at the Christmas Eve service. But they come, in all of their wealth, they come and they kneel. They humble themselves before the manger. Let's skip to verse 12. It says, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So now it's time to move again. Mary and Joseph continue this uncomfortable life that they said yes to. They're going to put a map on the screen. They had gone from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, for the census. Now they're going all the way to Egypt. Now this round trip is somewhere in the ballpark of 1,000 miles. They're being hunted, and so they have to leave and go to Egypt. All their plans, they're living on daily faith by the supernatural instruction of angels and dreams, and the Lord supernaturally providing and establishing their steps. But this is an uncomfortable life they've stepped into. Imagine walking a journey of 1,000 miles on foot with a young child. That's a long way to go. And yet they get up and they begin to flee. They're being hunted. Now notice in Mary and Joseph's life, notice where they really start to see all these supernatural things begin. They said yes to the Lord. They said yes to receiving Jesus. They step into something that's so far above their pay grade. They're in over their heads. They're uncomfortable. And yet they said yes. And then the Lord begins to move supernaturally because they've stepped out of their own control. In the same way that I believe we begin to see more of the supernatural move of God, the more that we're outside of our control. The more that we've stepped out in faith to say, God, I can't control all these things you've brought me into. I need you to come through. I don't know how to protect myself. I need you to come through. I don't know how to provide for myself. There's no way I can do it on paper. I need you to provide. If we want to see God move supernaturally, I believe that part of it is stepping out of what we can control ourselves. Otherwise, we'll naturally just cling to what we can do on our own strength. And so we see this miraculous life of Mary and Joseph, virgin births, dreams, angels, miraculous provision, because they've said yes to what God's doing. God equips those he's called. He equips those who are willing to step out in faith into something that they have not seen physically yet. He invites us into that adventure to step out of our own kingdom, out of our own economy, and step into his. We get the adventure of walking with him in his kingdom. I want to walk in that type of lifestyle. Like in Isaiah 22 talks about how God can open doors that no man can shut, and he shuts doors that no man can open. I don't want to be the man trying to beat open doors that God's not opening, or trying to shut doors that God's not shutting. I want to walk in his kingdom, his provision, his supernatural destiny for me, because he's the one that controls all that. He's the one that owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. That's the adventure I want to be part of. That's the journey I want to walk, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's unexpected, even if it's untimely, even if it requires patience or long suffering. That's the walk I want to walk. I want to walk in abandon, surrender to the Lord to the point where I need him to come through. That's what Mary and Joseph are doing right now. Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were of 2 years or under, according to the time that had been ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So here we see Herod's backup plan. He had ascertained the time that the star came, and therefore had a range of which the age of the child could be. And he sends his troops to go and to kill every male in Bethlehem and the surrounding area that fit that description. Now, this was well within the character of King Herod. King Herod actually killed 3 of his own sons, some of their wives. There were different times where there either were conspirators or he suspected conspirators, and he killed them all. Sometimes in one case, he killed all the conspirators or supposed conspirators and their families. He was willing to shed blood to protect his throne. It is well within his character. Now, Bethlehem was probably anywhere between 300 and 1,000 people. So Bethlehem's a small town. It also says the surrounding region. We don't know what the extent of that is. But if it was Bethlehem, and Bethlehem was about 1,000 people, you're probably, in a community that size, you're probably talking about 20 male children in that range. Which a king sending troops to go kill a bunch of 2-year-olds and under is an atrocity. It's something that is shocking. Yet here's what's interesting. The historians of the time don't mention it at all. There's a historian named Josephus who is a Jewish historian, a Jewish scholar. He doesn't even reference it. And people wonder why. Some people suppose that it's because it was in the character of Herod. Even something as atrocious as that was everyday life. Herod was willing to do it, and he would do it again. And so it's interesting that it's not even mentioned in historical record, at least that we've found. So verse 19, but when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. So they've gone the 500 or 600 miles out to Egypt. Now the angel of the Lord appears to him, saying, rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea, in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. It's amazing how God is walking them through the footsteps of fulfilling all the prophecies of the Old Testament. If you study that, all the prophecies that line up with Jesus, it is impossible for someone to just naturally check all those boxes. And yet the Lord is faithfully establishing each prophecy that was spoken over this child. But this angel comes, the angel of the Lord comes, and he says, go back to the land of Israel. He doesn't necessarily say Bethlehem, but he says, go back to the land of Israel. So they begin journeying back. And then Joseph realizes that Archelaus, the son of Herod, is now reigning in Judea. Let's go ahead and put that second map up. I've shown this before. Judea is there at the bottom. In the blue is Samaria and then Galilee. So they're making their way back to Judea, which is where Bethlehem and Jerusalem are. But then he realizes Archelaus is reigning. Now, Archelaus was even worse than his father, you could argue. In fact, he was actually potentially genetically insane. Some suppose that it's because of intermarriages within the family, that you could say he was as bad or worse than his father. And he had a reign of terror. He only reigned for about 10 years. But even Caesar Augustus thought he was too brutal, and he removed him from his post. When you have Caesar Augustus say, hey, man, you're too crazy, that's saying something about a ruler. I mean, those that ruled Rome were brutal, and yet he's saying this is too far, and he removes them. So this is Archelaus, the son of Herod, who is reigning. And so Joseph is afraid to go there, and again an angel comes and directs him to Galilee. And Galilee was Herod of Antipas. He was the half-brother of Archelaus, and he was a much more level-headed ruler. And so they go up to Nazareth, and they fulfill that prophecy. Between those two red circles, Nazareth and Bethlehem, is about 70 or 80 miles. But they're crossing over through Samaria and then ending up in Nazareth. So all this to say, as we're looking at the life and the reign of Herod, and we're looking at this narration of the Christmas story and Mary and Joseph going through all that they went through, it brings us to this realization that we cannot receive Jesus when there's pride in our hearts. Jesus and pride do not coexist on the throne of our hearts. Herod knew that only one could be on the throne. Do you know that there's one throne in your heart? And Jesus is threatening to that throne, not because he's mean, not because he's looking to do a hostile takeover, not because he's greedy, but he desires the throne of your heart. Why? Because it was meant for him. The throne of your heart was not meant for you. We're his. He wove us together. He purchased us. He paid the price for our life. We were made to be in communion with him. We were made to be yielded to him. We were made to be in intimacy with him, that nothing would separate us. We are his. And Jesus paid a price to bring us back as his children, as his heirs. And we have to make the same decision as Herod and the same decision as Jerusalem. Jesus has come. And Jesus continues to come on a daily basis. He continues to desire to bring what's new. And we have to ask ourselves, are we going to hold to our pride? Are we going to hold to our own throne? Are we going to hold to the status quo? Are we going to hold to what we can control? Or are we going to humble ourselves just like Jesus humbled himself as a baby in a manger? Are we going to go low the way that Jesus went low? Because he desires to be on the throne of our heart. When we look in Revelation 4, we see this picture. And it's of the throne room. And the throne of Jesus is in the center. And there's 24 thrones of the elders circled around. The other 24 are facing the one in the center, the true throne. And there's this picture in Revelation 4 where the elders are falling down before him in the center. They're casting their crowns before the throne of Jesus. And they're crying out, "Worthy are you to receive glory and honor and power to the one who deserves all the exaltation." Go ahead and stand with me. There's only one person that can sit on the throne of our heart at any given time. Jesus is the King of kings. He's the Lord of lords. His name is above every other name. He's gracious and he shares his inheritance, but he doesn't share his throne. He invites us as his kids to come sit with him in heavenly places. Think about that. The King of Kings on his throne says, hey, come sit by me. That's a radical thought. So he invites us to be with him. He invites us to abide. He was willing to step off his throne to come and be with us, God with us, but he does not share his throne. There is no name that matches with his. He is unmatched. He is unrivaled. He is far above every other name. And we receive him by laying down our own pride and making him first in our life. The preeminent one, the one who sits on the throne. And laying down our pride is actually one of the most freeing things. When we encounter the love of Jesus, when we truly encounter the love of Jesus, pride becomes unnecessary. We don't need it anymore. We don't need to prove anything. We don't need to control anything. We don't need to try and manufacture anything for ourselves. When we truly encounter the love of Jesus, it dismantles the need for pride. It dismantles the need for the status quo. It dismantles the need for our own control. And Jesus comes, like it says in Revelation 3:20, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone would open the door and invite me in, I'll come and dine with him. Like I said, it's not a hostile takeover. But he knows the best thing for us is for him to be on the throne of our heart. He's not greedy. He's not manipulative. He's not seeking his own gain. He knows that our best interest is for him to be on the throne of our heart. And he sits at our heart and he knocks. He desires to be welcomed in. He desires to come and dine with us. He desires to dismantle the fears that come with pride, the heaviness that comes with pride. He desires to crash in with his love to the point where we don't need the produce of our pride anymore. It's freeing. He desires to set us free. Each one of us this Christmas has the opportunity to humble ourselves and to kneel at the manger, to welcome in and receive the baby in the manger, to let go of all the other things and humble ourselves. And Jesus doesn't ask us to do anything that he hasn't already done for us. He humbled himself. And he became a frail baby. He humbled himself, even to the point of death on a cross. And he invites us to do the same. He invites us to lay down that pride, to encounter his love that drives out fear. So we're going to circle back to this song, "Oh Come, Let Us Adore Him." And I don't want us to just brush over this. I want us to take a moment to posture ourselves towards kneeling at the manger and adoring the Messiah who's come. I want us to press in and ask the Lord, God, is there anything that I've been trying to hold on to? If there's any flesh, would you cut it away? I lay it at your feet. I want us to take a moment and just adore him, laying down all the heavy burdens, laying down all the insecurities, all the frustrations, all the things that are outside our control, and just simply adore him. That we humble ourselves to receive him in his fullness. Not out of transaction, not with no strings attached, but we lay ourselves down, we go low, and receive all of who Jesus is, all of what he desires to do in and through us. Let's go ahead and sing together.